This week on Quadriga, Iran nuclear deal, forever delayed? After more than 10 years of talking about Iran's nuclear plans, international negotiators have decided that the best they can do is keep talking. The foreign ministers of Iran and 6 other countries have given themselves another 7 months to reach a deal that would allow Tehran peaceful nuclear technology, but prevent it moving quickly to build a nuclear weapon. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani was hoping agreement now would mean the end of economic sanctions imposed by Western countries, and a boost for political reform in the country. Instead, the continuing deadlock could mean more hardline rhetoric and make a final agreement even more difficult to achieve. So what are the chances of ending the nuclear standoff between Iran and the international community? And what changes could flow from such a deal, if it ever happens? Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Is it really a delay or is it a breakdown by another name? That's what we want to talk about today on Quadriga with 3 people who've been following events in Iran and the negotiations very closely. It's a pleasure to welcome Friedrich Thelen. He's founded the firm Thelen Consult after a 30-year career in journalism. The former Berlin bureau chief of the business weekly Wirtschaftswoche also worked for the renowned political weekly Die Zeit. And it's a pleasure to welcome Shayan Arkian. He is the head of the German Institute for Iranian Political and Economic Research and editor-in-chief of the website Iran Anders, which covers Iranian issues. He studied political philosophy and Shiite theology in Hamburg and at the Qum International University in Iran. And finally, it's a pleasure to have on the show again my Deutsche Welle colleague, Günter Knabe. He's formerly head of DW's Afghanistan and Asian departments, and for the past 10 years, he has served as diplomatic correspondent for Asia and the Islamic world. Shayan Arkian, do you really hold out any hope that the talks will ever reach agreement?
I'm sure I'm quite optimistic. I don't see it that the negotiation failed because it will start in the next several weeks. It's not like in the past that if the negotiation was failed, the next round of negotiation were in the next month or years. And the negotiators, all the diplomats and foreign ministers that took part on this negotiation are also quite optimistic, and so I am also optimistic because the important point is that both parties want this deal and there's no alternative to it.
Günter Knabe, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said after the talks had been postponed, postponing them wasn't going to make things any easier. Does it in fact make things a whole lot harder?
Yes, but it depends on, I agree with that, Jan, the next several months what will happen. Because parliamentary elections in Iran, we have to wait for that, and there will be decided whether the hardliners or the more soft-liners will prevail. This will have an impact upon the next round of talks. I call it a marathon, and now a few more kilometers are ahead of all sides. Secondly, the situation in the United States is also, of course, having a big impact on these talks and negotiations, and it makes it even more difficult for the US administration to carry on these talks in a positive way. So it will be carried on, I'm sure, but whether it will come to a really positive, satisfying result for both sides, I doubt.
So we had one optimistic view, one somewhat ambivalent view. Friedrich Thelen, you can be a tiebreaker here. U.S. Secretary of State Kerry, we're going to hear in a moment. We've got some voices from people involved in the negotiations. He claims the talks made real and substantial progress. Many Iranian media, on the other hand, after the breakdown was announced, or after the postponement was announced, were using the word nothing to describe what had been achieved. What do you think?
First, I wouldn't take Foreign Secretary too strongly on his words, because he's a diplomat, and diplomats say things which can be interpreted in all ways. So, well, you could find the pro and the con in every speech of a diplomat, even a chief diplomat. But one has to look on the fringes of this, because not having an agreement there means the ball is back, for instance, in the American Senate. and the Congress, where new majorities are in a position to make life a bit harder for President Obama. There is also a strong Israeli fraction within the hawkish Republican. There are more of them. There are some who are also taking the sorrows of Israel more important in the Democratic Party. So it depends whether the White House can keep the two parties in line for that. And, if Obama is able to keep at hold and not living as a president without his parliament and going forward and doing things which later can be recalled by his own parliament, well, that will be a difficult situation. So I think the second battlefield for it is not only what the negotiations do, it's also what is the impact from the United States.
So, both of you saying domestic politics, both in Iran and the U.S., will play a big, big role. Let us take a look at a few of the voices of people who were involved in the negotiations or had a strong opinion about where they were heading.
These talks aren't going to suddenly get easier just because we extend them. They're tough, and they've been tough, and they're going to stay tough.
The agreement hasn't been reached yet, but there's been substantial progress. We will continue talking, and in 3 or 4 months, we hope to have a document containing all the main principles of the agreement.
The major obstacle was that there is a compounded mistrust, mutual.
We have to use the momentum that's been seen here in Vienna. We must not delay. We have to continue focused and intensive talks over the coming days and weeks.
On the nuclear issue, the United States and the European colonialist countries gathered and applied their entire force to bring the Islamic Republic to its knees. But they could not, and they will not.
So a plurality of opinions there, to put it mildly. Shayan Akyan, let's take a look at where things stood as the talks were shut down temporarily. In 2 days of apparently very tense negotiations, just a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. offered to let Iran operate 4,500 centrifuges. That was quite a significant increase from the 1,500 the West had been proposing earlier on. So basically tripling the number of centrifuges that they would be willing to see Iran continue to operate. Sounds like a pretty significant concession, yet it wasn't good enough.
I'm not sure that it's really so that the U.S. proposed 4,500 centrifuges. As far as I know, we have no information about the details of the negotiations. 2 points were very important why both parties could not conclude the negotiation. 1 point is the sanction reliefs, and 1 point is the number of the centrifuges. But I think the number of the centrifuges is more a political issue. Political means, because the U.S. position is that Iran should have only less numbers of centrifuges, in order that if one day Iran wants to decide to build a nuclear bomb, it needs 1 year. But to build a nuclear bomb, you also need other necessary components, not just to have the enrichment, uranium enrichment. And the other necessary components, experts say Iran needs many years to build it. So I think it's not productive to focus on the issue of the number of the centrifuges, because Iran is already inspected by the IAEA. If one day Iran wants to decide to build a nuclear bomb, it also needs to build other necessary components, and there's much time gap to avoid it.
Günter Knabe, would you agree with that? There are huge teams of negotiators there at work in Vienna. I happened to have been there when they were meeting early in the summer, and astonishing to see that immense team of experts and so on. Are they really all on the wrong track talking about centrifuges?
Well, there's one part. I agree with Arkan that this is only one part of any preparation for producing a nuclear bomb in Iran. But it's an important part. What I'm a little bit confused about is this expression breakout, meaning 1 year time that Iran could have, or that they will stay from now on, 1 year on, Iran will be able to have a nuclear bomb ready. My question is then,
to have high enriched uranium.
Yes, right.
It's just
but then
one
my
component.
question is, what will happen then? You see, if today there is nobody ready to go to war, aside maybe from one country in that region, to prevent Iran to get a nuclear bomb ready, if the situation is there that the international community, which is looking very keenly on the process, decides from 1 year from now on, Iran will have a nuclear bomb ready, what will happen then? This is something very confusing.
Surely the idea is that the IAEA then steps in if it sees that there is progress in that direction and imposes sanctions.
But what means does IAEA have at hand to really stop Iran from producing that nuclear bomb?
Well, you could also ask, what do sanctions today do? That is at least something. It's a method to slow down the development. But first, I think before we get to the point, that even in that declaration, it was meant that Iran cannot quickly build. They didn't say not build at all, but quickly. So the question is upwards when you're solve one problem after the next. And by the way, it's not the one country you mentioned, which is very, very much keen that Iran doesn't get
Israel,
apart from
Israel.
Israel. Yeah. If the Iranis go nuclear, then Turkey, which is in a position to, will get nuclear too, and the Saudis will look at it. And that is something, so even the Russians come into it. That's why the Russians, or even Putin phoning in the middle of the heat of that discussion and brought himself in. Apart from PR, it is an interest. The whole region depends on keeping the nuclear base very, very low, because otherwise blows up on another frontier.
Let me come back a little bit later to the geopolitics of the region as a whole, but let's perhaps stay with the viewpoint from Iran. Do we know how much room for maneuver, how much bargaining space the Iranian negotiating team really had?
The problem is we, the West, does not just negotiate with Mr. Zarif and the teams, and also with the Iranian people. Because according to the opinion polls conducted by University of Maryland and other U.S. Institutes, the majority of the Iranians favor the nuclear program as it today, more than 90%. And the interesting point is the Iranian people are not confident with the negotiations. They think it will be fail, and the West just use the nuclear program as a pretext to sanction and pressure Iran.
So why is Iran, but according to that line of argument, why is Iran in the negotiations at all?
Because it's the promise of Mr. Rouhani to the EU government to relieve the sanctions. And I think we have to use this opportunity in the West. At the moment, we have a moderate government in Iran, and we have used this opportunity approximately 10 years ago. Iran has a liberal government, and that government was at that time happy to have just 32 centrifuges only for research purpose. And we in the West rejected this offer. And now Iran has several thousand centrifuges. And I think if we do not reach a deal, it will be very counterproductive.
Well, may I put you one first? How sharp are the bites of the sanctions? What does it do to the Iranian economy? And second, you talked about 70% of the Iranian people asked by a poll. Are they in favor of the nuclear program to build a nuclear bomb, or are they in favor of having nuclear for energy and producing?
For nuclear energy, of course, not for atomic.
The same polls
also comes to the results that the majority of Iranians are against the nuclear bomb, and the majority of Iranians knows about the religious verdict, the fatwa of the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who says that nuclear bombs are forbidden in Islam.
Günter Knabe, the bite of the sanctions. I want to hear what Shayan Akian has to say about this as well, but what are you hearing about the degree to which Iranians are suffering under the sanctions? We've heard a large majority of Iranians does seem to support the nuclear program, at least as an energy program. Yeah. Doesn't a large majority also want sanctions relief?
Of course. This is the major, I think, motivation for also the Iranian side during these negotiations, because the sanctions are biting quite a bit. Iranian economy is going down more and more. And the government is forced to do something about it. Think of joblessness. The Iranian people are more than 50% are less than 30 years or around 30 years. So there are no jobs for younger people. Then secondly, the currency is going down. Importing things is going down. And due to sanctions, a lot of things are breaking down. Like say, for example, Iranian airlines are also suffering because they don't buy or get spare parts. So the sanctions bite quite a bit, and therefore I think Iranian government, the present Iranian government, was ready to agree to what has agreed upon, because that's not very little. You see, they stopped and are stopping enriching uranium, and they have been forced to dilute uranium enriched to bomb grade. So there are certain, let's say, successes within what has been done already. And back to the sanctions, I think they are really biting. But on the other hand, I would doubt whether this finally would bring the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, to renege to any American, let's say, pressure. And secondly, one should not forget about the very important role of the Revolutionary Guard, because they are playing a very important role in the background. And they are certainly against any reneging towards the US or the West.
I want to hear your response to that in just one moment, but Friedrich Thelen, the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Democrat Senator Menendez, said the cycle of negotiations followed by an extension coupled with sanctions relief for Iran has not succeeded. In other words, basically saying the whole sanctions approach, the idea that that would serve as a potential carrot if sanctions were lifted, that has not had significant impact. Do you think that is correct?
No. This is the ongoing spiritual war in the Senate. There are some.
He's a Democrat, don't forget.
Yeah. But there are some Democrats are hawkish as well. It is they're on the Republican side in this struggle. There are some voices within the American Congress say we must put on more sanctions to teach the Khomeini and the rest a lesson. And there are others said, well, if we overdo it, we won't have a settlement. And well, it's poor Obama is in the middle of this battle, which is totally. Well, it's in foreign policy, but it's also home consumption. It's show the president is a lame duck. He cannot even bring this wonderful anti-nuclear bomb program through. This is where internal politics comes into foreign politics. It does everywhere, but it's not always so visible as it does in the US Senate.
Shayan Akian, what are the political consequences in Iran if the sanctions aren't lifted, if the economic pain continues? Who pays the price politically in Iran?
Of course, the government, because the government always pursue the negotiation and told we can be successful to reach a deal with P5+1. And I think if the negotiation failed totally, then maybe the moderate government could not fulfill any of the promises which she gave.
Meaning the breakdown of
sanctions,
postponement of the talks could work to boost.
Also democratic reforms, because if the government reached a nuclear deal, it makes it much more stronger to pursue the other democratic reforms.
Yet, on the other hand, you told us public opinion is so solidly behind the nuclear program. would people really accept a deal, or could that too have proved counterproductive?
There's also many opinion polls about that issue, which how should be a deal looked that the majority of Iran can accept. And of course, the sanctions bite, and for Iranian people, having a good economic livelihood is important. But what is much more important for the Iranians is to be politically independent, and that also shows the opinion polls.
Yeah,
so,
agree.
Are you saying in the end the delay is likely to boost hardliners?
Yes, if the negotiation failed, then the hardliners will be boosted, because the hardliners can say, we always told that we cannot reach a deal with the West.
And Günter Knabe said we have to always look at the role of the Revolutionary Guard. What is the status now, right now, of the Revolutionary Guard and its power within the government, within the elite?
As long as the supreme leader is, and he's the ultimate decision maker in foreign and security politics in the Islamic Republic of Iran, as long as he supports the negotiation, the other hardliners cannot prevent Mr. Rouhani to make the deal. And even the hardline cleric Ayatollah Janati, the chairman of the Garden Council, pursued the negotiation several weeks ago. The commander of the Revolutionary Guards, Mr. Jafari, supports the negotiation if it's led to the lifting of sanctions.
Günter Knabe, how much support is really there? The opinion of many media in the U.S. is that the Supreme Leader, Mr. Khamenei, he basically let the negotiations go on, but had essentially formed no opinion whatsoever and was planning to weigh in once an agreement was there. In other words, a kind of a two-track process. Let them do this, and then afterwards I'll decide whether I support it or not. Do you think that's right?
I suppose, yes. Probably the negotiators on the Iranian side were on a rather short leash in the hands of Ali Khamenei, and they do know that. I think the Iranian policy is a very sophisticated one. These two tracks you mentioned are exactly the right thing. They now want to get rid of at least parts of the sanctions to save their own political fate and also do something good for their own people. On the other hand, having still the right reserved to say no. And one thing I think is also important, we should not forget about the national pride of the Iranian people. They don't want to be belittled by whatever means, but whatever government or state from abroad anyway. This is a very important factor even the Iranian supreme leader has to think of, and he will probably think of.
Friedrich Thelen, one of my media colleagues suggested that the talks might as well be called P5 plus 1, the one is Germany, of course, plus 2, because of the role played by hardliners in Iran and in the U.S. You yourself suggested that thanks to the recent midterm elections in the U.S., the situation for President Obama might be not all that different from what we're describing here. One track is the negotiating track, which he clearly did support. The other track is, would this agreement, even if it could be reached, make it through the Senate?
Yeah, good question.
Two-third majority is needed.
Very good question. But in the negotiators, they talk to the Israeli as well. And if the signs from Tel Aviv are saying, okay, we can tolerate that, then a big part of the hawkish fraction in both political parties in the House could switch to each other. But I do think there is no alternative. It's really a Margaret Thatcher situation, because the sanctions stay on, the economy deteriorates. That could kill the government, but then you get a new government, and Iran, you get a new government there, but the new government is not really lifting the sanctions, and the rest of the world can stand around and carry on with the sanctions. And there is none, I repeat that, there is none government in the world, neither Moscow or anyone, supporting then, without the media, the economy of Iran. So the way out is an agreement. and the other side has more time.
That, of course, is the whole idea of sanctions. And I must say, ever since I studied international politics much longer ago than I would care to admit, there's been this huge debate among political scientists. Are sanctions effective or not? Sanctions are very much premised on a rational actor idea, the idea that a country under sanctions suffering economic pain is going to change its behavior because it would be irrational not to do so. Certainly that doesn't seem to be the case with Russia right now. And is it necessarily the case with Iran?
The point is a different one. Russia still lives on export of raw material. They sort of devour their own riches, not enriching them. I mean, oil and gas and the rest. There is no hunger. But if these sanctions, that was my question to you, how much biting is a system of sanctions? If that leads to part of the economy of the people not having enough to eat, I don't know that. But then the government, in other cases, could fall, as governments did in the 19th century, in similar situations, not with nuclear bombs, naturally. But they sort of started a war to someone, a breakout. But there is no breakout. To whom? What will the Iran do? Attack someone in the neighborhood? Do the Kuwaiti game? I mean, that's what Saddam Hussein did years and years ago. There is no alternative. They must come to a settlement. Both sides must come to a settlement. But the rest of the world can easily live with continuing sanction against Iran. Nobody is going to break them.
Shayan Akian?
Yes, the sanctions are biting, but the sanctions does not lead to end the nuclear program, because the majority of Iran does not blame their own government, they blame the foreigners. Because of it does not work, sanctions.
And there is nobody starving from hunger yet, and won't be starving.
That's why I asked how much these sanctions are biting. Are they?
It's biting, but not so much as we expected.
Okay. And certainly not.
Yeah, then both sides have a lot of time to, if the sanctions are not in a way taking the country in the grip and then ruining the sort of confidence base this government has, this prime minister, if that's not the case, then it's going to go on. Then even the 6 months enlargement, postponement of the solution, well, okay, it's not changing it, and that means even in 6 months you can come to a solution. But there are sanctions, which, by the way, historically, which have forced governments to do things. I mean, sanctions are not without effect. They have.
Günter Knabe, there's a strong pressure now in the U.S. coming, among other things, also from the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, a very strong pro-Israeli lobby, to actually now apply more sanctions again. All through the course of the negotiations, there had been hardliners in the U.S. Congress saying, we need to keep the pressure on, we can't let the pressure up. And of course, those voices are now even louder. Do you suppose that we will see a move in that direction, and what would the effects be?
Probably not. Of course, Israel is a very important point of view, or state government in this whole negotiations, and they are very, very hard, and they have got their lobby, of course, in the States. You mentioned it already. But then, on the other hand, for Iran, and even in particular for the US, there is another aspect we did not yet mention. The present situation in the near Middle East with IS, Islamic State, is playing into the hands of the Iranian government, because to some extent the Americans are now needing Iran as not an ally, but at least a temporary partner cooperating on a limited field, meaning fighting the Islamic State. And therefore, the Iranians, of course they do know that, are in a stronger position than before. And that changes, I think, in general, the whole setup for these negotiations. And therefore, probably the Americans are, not just only the Americans, quite satisfied that the talks are simply going on with no biting changings, particular because they don't want to provoke Iran too much. On the other hand, they want to kind of allure the Iranian government, the Iranians, to, as I said, cooperate fighting Islamic State, because this is the common interest of both parts.
Shahin Akian, Günter Knabe said in the past a government under pressure from outside might embark on a war in order to distract domestic attention. Well, in fact, Iran has been involved in the conflict in some ways directly, in some ways indirectly, supporting Bashar Assad, for example, in Syria. And many people say Iran is the main beneficiary of the massive changes going on in the Middle East as the Shiite power in the region. Could that change Iran's behavior? Is it possible that we might see an evolution now in the sense of taking responsibility for the region, of becoming a stakeholder, of coming back into the game?
I think the current circumstances in the Middle East does not lead to a changing of behaviors in Iran. It's leading to a changing of behaviors in the West, because it shows that the West needs Iran for fighting IS and in Iraq and in Syria. But the problem is we have common interests in fighting the IS in Iraq, but not the common interest in fighting IS in Syria, where Iran supports Assad and the US wants the downfall of Assad. And currently there is also corporations. The Iranians, proxies in Iraq are fighting IS on the ground and the US on the sky.
And do you think that is making any difference in terms of attitudes within the Iranian elite, either the government of Rouhani or perhaps even among the Revolutionary Guard?
I think the conflict about the Iranian nuclear program, it's a shadow about all these issues. If the nuclear program problem is solved, then I am sure there will be a rapprochement between USA and Iran, also in the case of Syria. Because it's not so that Iran wants not at any price to have Assad. It just wants to have someone who pursue also and respect also the Iranian interests there.
Friedrich Thelen, it's actually U.S. conservatives, those Republicans who supposedly don't want any agreement with Iran, who are most worried about ISIS. Could this factor, the factor that Iran's help might be instrumental in fighting ISIS, change any minds in that group?
Yes, it could. Well, if the government plays a good game, it said, oh, look, folks, do you want the IS to enlarge its realm? And if we need the Iranians as stabilizers in the area, as associates or allies is a bit strong, but as stable element, then we must not dump them. I mean, and give it. That's my reason. There is enough room to maneuver in this negotiation, because for the first time, well, at the end of the Cold War, foreign policy has become more difficult. It's not here the Moscows, or the leftish or communist realm, and the others. Now it's all different interests in there. And if you put your hand into that bottom of snakes, you could be beaten by all, even by those which you support. So. There is realm to maneuver and interest of both sides. That is the most important thing in foreign policy. It's interest. And the West, inclusive Obama naturally, wants peace in the region. And it's also a truce. That would be even a goal. And Iran wants enriched plutonium for its nuclear energy. And all the rest, the others have other difficult. So every moment of stability which gets into the peace in that in the peace, as I call it, peace or truce process, is accepted.
Günter Knabe, would Israel ever accept a full and strong Iran as a real legitimate player in the region?
If that Iran would be without the nuclear bomb, yes, they would be happy to have a stable Iran. Mind you, relations between Iran and Israel under the Shah in Shah were very, very good. And at that time, Iran was the strongest power between Israel and the Indian subcontinent. And they're on the way to become again that strongest power in that field. And such a stable, I repeat, non-nuclear Iran, in the sense of without a nuclear bomb, would be also, I think, acceptable for the Israeli government, because there's another conflict I would like to draw attention to. It's the conflict between Shia and Sunni Muslims. Therefore, Iran and Saudi Arabia are enemies and will stay enemies. And this is also a factor Israel has to keep in mind. Let me focus on one or draw attention to one aspect of kind of...
How does that, perhaps just briefly tell us how that plays into the question of whether an agreement with Iran could be reached? The fact that Saudi Arabia and Israel are also enemies.
Well, the thing is, back to Israel. Israel will never, never accept Iran with a nuclear bomb. They would really go to war, I suppose. The only country that would be ready to do that. That would be catastrophe. And I hope that then the United States, should that come about, that situation, would be strong enough to rein in Israel from that catastrophe movement. Now, the play is very difficult, as you mentioned already. The Americans are in a very difficult situation because they need, of course, Saudi Arabia also. They want to be, if not friends, but on a workable relation with Iran. It's really very, very difficult. But one thing I would like to mention, there are already fields on which the US and the Iranians are working tacitly together. Look at Afghanistan, and look at another aspect which is also of common interest for us, the West, Iran, and Russia. That's the heroin, drug trafficking, and so on. There is also a certain kind of cooperation. So what you said, interests are the mainly deciding factors. All the other things are not important.
So, Shahin Akyan, what has to happen between now and that deadline, 7 months away, till which the agreement date has been postponed? What has to happen for real confidence building to occur?
Oh, it's a very good question. As I said, I'm sure that I'm quite optimistic that we will reach a final agreement, and if not, at least a second interim agreement where the outstanding points will be resolved or settled later. Both have common interests in Afghanistan, in Iraq, also in the energy sectors. There is a huge common interest between USA, Iran, and the West. And if both parties consider this common interest, then there will be also easier to...
How much sense of that common interest is there in Tehran? What do you hear from people in Tehran? Is there an idea of commonality? Certainly what we heard there in that little report from Khamenei did not indicate that he has a great sense of commonality with the West.
We should not misunderstand the role of the supreme leader and his harsh rhetorics. Actually, he's a very pragmatic actor, and the harsh rhetorics has the aim to integrate the hardliners of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The main role of the supreme leader in Iran is to maintain stability, and this harsh rhetorics is to show to the hardliners don't be concerned that everything is in control. It's an interesting point is the former government, the so-called hardliner government of Mr. Ahmadinejad. In the negotiation with P5+1, it was always Iran who told to the West why we should only discuss the nuclear matter. Let us start about the whole region. It was always the West that blocked this kind of negotiation. So I think the Iranian sides are ready to have cooperation with the West.
Confidence building measures between now and the deadline. Günter Knabe, what has to happen?
First of all, let me mention that the talks are not postponed. They will go on very shortly in December and on what Steinmeier said.
The deadline has been postponed.
That's right. Continue. That's right. But that's an important aspect of it. No postponement, but going on, carrying on the momentum. Then perhaps it would be not well advised that both sides should shelve the major problems for some time and work on other trust-building measures. What I mentioned, dealing with Afghanistan, dealing with ISI, there are so many common interests they should put into the foreground. I would say two things. If there wouldn't be Israel's interest being 1000% anti-nuclear bomb in Iranian hands, there would be a vast field of cooperation between Iran and the West. And from my knowledge of the Iranian people and having been there recently, I can just say the majority of the Iranians are looking toward the West. They consider themselves to be part of more or less the Western culture since long, long time.
Friedrich Thelen, we often hear calls for a major regional conference to include all of these actors and to talk about what to do to stop this conflagration from spreading in the Middle East. Can you imagine such a thing ever coming to pass?
I wouldn't say anything about ever. But at the moment, the interests are so different and the powers are not really stabilized. I mean, the frontiers are totally open in Iraq and with the IS here and there. I don't think this conference would lead to any solution. I think time has to go on, which this is unfortunate for people suffering in there. But there are not players from outside who can enforce it. Well, it's not like in the time, as I said before, in the Cold War, if Moscow or Washington decided on something, then it was done. But now there's so many different, and you can't solve this in a conference. In Berlin in 1876, you had this conference about the Crimean War. Forces knew, the Russians, the Austrians, the Turks, the British, and the Germans negotiated, sitting around with interest, and it was settled. The war was over. But here, it goes on, and this is, I think, not to be solved in a conference.
How worried are the Iranians about other regional powers also getting the bomb? Israel, of course, already has it. That's a commonly assumed fact. What about Saudi Arabia? Would Iran look with equanimity on a nuclear Saudi Arabia?
That's a very good question, because this question shows that Iran has no interest to nuclear bombs, because Iran also knows if it will be acquire the bombs, the next is Saudi Arabia, who financed the nuclear bomb in Pakistan. Who knows why they finance a bomb in Pakistan maybe for someday to get it, because so in this sense the Iranian has no interest to have nuclear bombs, because it knows the geostrategic advantage that they actually have because of its size will be thrown away if they have a nuclear bomb and the others have also nuclear bombs, and there will be a part situation.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. I'm sure we'll have other opportunities to revisit the subject on this program. Many thanks to all of you for being with us. Thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.